Good evening, everyone. I am inviting my wonderful panelists to join me on the stage for tonight's program. And this is a really special event charting the future of Impressionist studies. So I thank all of you for coming out on a Tuesday night to engage with us on topics that are, for us at least, really pressing and important right now to think about the future of this artwork, of academic study, of exhibition work of this material. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicole Myers, Chief Curatorial and Research Officer here at the DMA, and the Barbara Thomas Lemmon Senior Curator of European Art, and I can't help myself, Barbara is in the audience tonight, so it's always such an honor for me to get to say that when I introduce myself. I'm also the curator of the Impressionist Revolution from Monet to Matisse, which is the featured exhibition that I hope you've all had the chance to see and to spend time in. If you haven't, we're in the final countdown. The exhibition will close on November 3rd, and I encourage you to come and spend a lot of time, especially with treasures that are typically not on view due to sensitivity to light. But it's this exhibition that prompted this exciting program that the DMA is really proud and pleased to co-present with the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. Before we begin, I really want to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Carol Bertel, who reached out to me to see whether we could offer a program around this Impressionist exhibition, but as part of the inaugural celebrations of UTD's beautiful new Athenaeum Museum, which just opened really only a few weeks ago. If you have not had the chance yet to go up to Richardson to see it, it is a gorgeous building filled with a variety of different collections, including a selection of works from the DMA's permanent collection curated by Dr. Michael Thomas. So there's so much to see and to do there. Now, the Athenaeum was really the brainchild and the dream of Carol's late husband, Rick Bertel, who, as many of you will know, is a former DMA director, the founding director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History, or EODIA, as we like to call it, as well as a specialist of Impressionism. I mean, really one of these great legends that scholars like us grow up reading, and what a thrill it was for me when I arrived here in 2016 to then get to know, to work, and to look at artwork with, talk about Impressionism with one of these really iconic art historians that set certain trends within the studies of this material tonight. So it's really bittersweet, of course, to be having this program without Rick here in the room, because I know he was deeply invested in the topics we're going to be exploring, was deeply invested in younger generations of art historians and scholars, in wanting the studies to continue and to find new and exciting ways to think about and present this material. But I know he's here with us in spirit. So from those initial conversations with Carol came this generous opportunity extended by Dr. Michael Thomas, who succeeded Rick as director of EODIA. When Michael reached out to ask if I might be interested in co-presenting some kind of program, again on the topic of Impressionism around our exhibition, I knew exactly what I wanted to propose, because it's a question that's really been simmering in the back of my mind, certainly since our show opened several months ago now. And that question, to put it bluntly, is, what's next? Are there any stones left unturned on this wildly popular and well-trodden subject? What new approaches or trends are emerging in the field on Impressionism and its protagonists, on whom thousands of books, articles, exhibitions, and films have been made and staged in the last 150 years since the birth of the Impressionist movement and that fateful first exhibition at Nadar Studio in Paris in 1874. These are very serious and sincere questions on my part, especially as fewer and fewer academic programs are teaching Impressionism. For those of you who don't have connections to universities, this is a decidedly unpopular topic these days. And as I often say to any of my interns or research assistants, anyone who's coming into the museum that's still somewhat open to possibility, I always say, if you have any interest in working on Impressionism, or perhaps more broadly, late 19th century French avant-garde artwork, this is the time, because there's going to be an absolute crisis in our field of museums, given the strengths of most American collections, like ours, on view in the exhibition, that is dedicated to collecting and presenting this material. And at least to this point, what seems to be the endless sort of hunger and interest in a broad public in seeing this artwork and learning about it and looking at it and thinking about it. So really, what are we going to do? And so I want, at this moment, really to thank very sincerely Shelby Bennett, my incredible research assistant, who is one of these younger generations of up-and-coming scholars, and I hope curator one day, who wants to work on 19th century. And it is thanks to her and her arduous research into looking into this topic. I mean, she scoured the dozens and dozens of recent books and articles, conference panels, dissertations in progress, to really help put together this highly selected panel to bring together different perspectives. And you'll see there's already a bit of a generational shift as well between those of us even on this stage and thinking about mid-career and emerging scholars, where the field's going. Do we like where it's going? And again, where are the avenues we think where exciting things are still left to be discovered and mined? So just briefly, and I will introduce them in greater detail before their various discussions tonight, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. So from your left to right, it's André Dombrowski, Genevieve Westerby, and Mary-Dailey Desmarais. And hopefully you picked up some handouts as you came in if you want a very full bio on these three different scholars, their work, and some of their recent interests. But really, each of them reflects a different approach to Impressionism. And I've asked each of them the same question, which is why it's always really wonderful to see the lens that we've all taken in thinking about this question that I asked everyone to consider, which is, where is the field going? Sounds simple, right? And how are you all engaging again with this very popular, but also really daunting topic? I mean, good luck trying to read all of the material that's out there on this subject before even trying to think about your own innovative or unique perspective or interpretation. So why Impressionism and why now? If you do not know, 2024 is the 150th year anniversary of that very first Impressionist exhibition that I mentioned earlier, held in Paris. So the DMA is joining dozens of museums across the United States, in France, and other parts of Europe, and probably also further afield around the world, in mounting exhibitions that explore this absolutely revolutionary movement, addressing the many myths and also misunderstandings that are perhaps as widespread as the enthusiasm for this artwork is. So our exhibition is told through 90 works. All but 5 are in the DMA's collection, which is really extraordinary just to show the depth of the collection. We have about 5 works coming from local private collections, and some of them are in the audience tonight as well. So I can't thank you enough again for your generous support in helping us tell a more complete and compelling story. But our exhibition really tells 2 parallel stories. The first is what I sort of charged myself with in the beginning, which is to tell the story of Impressionism and not just stay there, not just point out what was so radical and revolutionary about it, a story that still is not exactly embedded in public knowledge, but also to take a look at its long-reaching legacy that's still reflected in art making and exhibition practices today and that is really taken for granted. You know, this is a rare instance where an art movement has made this giant leap from the world of high art to pop culture. And it's to such a high degree that almost anyone you might grab here in the United States and pull aside, you know, and ask, do you know what Impressionism is? Might you describe a picture or maybe a name of an artist, even if you don't know too much about it? So it's very familiar to us. And yet, at the same time, there's not a lot that is known about it, you know, in terms of it being a collective of contemporary artists, for example, for starters, and not a style. So there's a lot still for us to do there, just in spreading a lot of the scholarship, of course, that already exists in this. And so you'll sort of see this in the show, this idea, too, that these discoveries, these innovations that were made in the 1870s, 1880s, they don't just stop, you know, when the calendar moves forward to 1900, that in fact the seeds that they sowed that were so radical would sow the seeds of most of the isms we think about as various kinds of modernism into the early 20th century. So you see that in our exhibition. But the second story is a bit more subtle, and I already kind of hinted at that, which is the story of collecting this material right here in Dallas. The DMA's incredible holdings are due largely to 3 prominent philanthropists. This would be the Munger family, Wendy and Emery Reeves, and also Margaret and Eugene McDermott, that together built, really only in the last 35 years, the extraordinary holdings, again, that really mark your passage through the 6 exhibition sections that we have over in our Chilton spaces. It is a very new collection. I can't stress that enough. Most museums started, especially on the East Coast, while Monet was still alive in the late 19th century. The fact that we really didn't start until 1984 with the Reeves First Gift is pretty extraordinary in and of itself. And I won't go into the reasons why that might be, but it's pretty exciting ultimately to think about the fact that it's a very American story and that our collection is a very Dallas story. Before we consider the future of Impressionist studies, I thought it would actually be helpful to take a very brief, very incomplete, and probably way too simplified look at some of the context and the sort of major approaches that have defined how we as art historians, as scholars, as curators, learn about this material, the critical lenses that we are taught to apply to it, how we think about it and talk about it, basically what's become. So I'm taking us way back into the 16th century, in fact, to kind of at least start with a kind of model that was started by a writer named Vasari. He was also an artist and painter himself, who created biographies on sort of great living artists at the time. The original was published in 1550. It was revised in 1568. It is still published, as you can see there on the right today, that we still look at these as primary sources, even though it's mostly secondhand, and it's a good read, lots of gossip, some of which is true, some of which we know now is not, but really kind of sets the tone for the idea of a lone genius, the artist who is touched by divine inspiration and is kind of working in a silo outside the context of history, of society, that is not the main drive, that the sort of drive to create is coming from within. At this time, they might have even thought that it was God-given, for example. And I have to note, in fact, too, that this concept of the lone genius, the lone artistic genius, was also thought to be, at this point, exclusively male. That was kind of baked into it, right? So that was like a certain model and this concept of originality, that it's one artist rather than an artist working with a workshop, which of course we know our production in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Baroque, that this was how artists worked. You had maybe your master artist, but you were surrounded by a team of people who helped make the art. But that myth kind of persists, this idea of the kind of lone shark, if you will, that is not really connected, even though of course we know that no man or woman is an island, and that, as we will talk about briefly tonight, that this idea of social art history, of kind of looking at actually all of the context in which art is made, consumed, purchased, sold, exhibited, shared, is very much a part that's relevant of how we look at art and how we think about it. Now, within Impressionist studies in particular, probably the most significant approach that really came out as a criticism that developed from Impressionism and Cézanne's work, really in particular, is something today that we call formalism. And it's this idea that what's the most important thing in pictures at the time, this was coming about in the late 19th century, was a work's purely visual qualities. That's to say its colors, its composition, maybe the facture of the brushwork, the composition, rather than the narrative content, or let's say its relationship to the natural, visible world. So this developed in the 1890s really in response to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, what we call that today, the artists that came after Impressionism, like Cézanne, like Bernard, that I'm showing you there on the screen. And again, it was this kind of reaction in many ways that placed a lot of emphasis just on the style and not on what was being depicted. That's not to say that's what the artists were doing, but this was a critical lens that was developing at the time. And its fate was sealed by an habit painter who's a contemporary. We have a great example in our exhibition right now of Cézanne, of Bernard, again, that you're seeing there on the screen. He starts his career as an habit painter inspired by Gauguin. And in 1890, he publishes a manifesto that he calls the definition of neo-traditionism. Okay, that ism didn't catch on. We don't really talk about neo-traditionism today, but he really emphasized that the point of artwork actually should be aesthetic pleasure that we take in looking at the painting or the art object, not its subject. So this was a really big break, in fact, from where emphasis had been placed in the importance of artwork up to this moment. And there's this very famous quote that I can't help but read to you that gives you some sense, too, of where this kind of formalist approach will lead. And that in this manifesto from 1890, Denis writes, "Remember that a picture, before it's a picture of a battle horse, a nude woman, or some story, is essentially a flat surface covered in colors arranged in a certain order." And this right there will really provide the seeds for abstraction, the idea that it's not intended to be a window on the world, that it is an aesthetic object, it's decoration, it's ornamentation, something that Denis, Seruzier, Bernard, for example, you see them playing with right there. And certain critics later looking back, like Roger Fry or Clement Greenberg is probably the biggest name that we think of when we talk about this kind of formalist march towards abstraction, this kind of one way of looking at a kind of development of artwork. So that really existed for quite some time. You get these two poles of this kind of, artistic genius, and we think about formalism and sort of the march towards modernism as we look back on it, to be fair, in the 20th century, until we hit the 1970s-ish, where there was a new development of a kind of approach, a methodology that we call social art history, that really kind of hit a moment with scholars that were graduate students in the 1970s and then were professors in the 1990s, so really had a good 20 years to kind of publish and think about their ideas. Two of the greats that come to mind are T.J. Clark, who happens to be André's advisor, and Linda Nochlin, who happens to be my advisor, and really formed a generation of art historians coming up that we didn't know there was any other art history, that there was any other way than to look at artwork through the lens of artists and their experience of their lived time, or an interest in modernity when we're talking about 19th century painting, especially against the backdrop in the second half of the Industrial Revolution. So both Clark and Nochlin both kind of started in many ways working on realist painters like Gustave Courbet, who was so radical in his time, maybe not for the style per se, but for enlarging what were everyday lower middle class people attending the first burial in a new cemetery in Ornon, where the artist was from, and elevating it to the scale. If you've ever seen this thing, it's just maybe not the height, but it's definitely longer than the screen that's here. It's huge. They're almost life-size. This idea of elevating it to the size of history painting was something new. Or an artist like Millet, The Gleaners, 1857. These art historians were looking at this through the subjects, going back to the subjects, identifying issues of class, of labor, who's being depicted, who has the privilege of depicting, looking at the politics of gaze, who's looking at this, who is it intended for, in terms of who would look at this, and really considering, again, all of these social and historical moments that no matter what, artists couldn't escape, both in the subjects they're painting, but also really forming many of their approaches, including naturalism or realism, that are coming out in this first half of the 19th century. And within that, you get sort of more subgroups. So Linda Nochlin being the first, if not one of the very first, at least to be credited with forming what we now call feminist art history within this lens of social art history, was to look at issues of class and politics, not just in terms of what's being produced, but also in who gets to make the art. So for example, her very famous, well, it started as an article in Art News in January of 1971, has been republished many times. It's an essay titled, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And really examining systemic bias, institutional bias, systems of education, who has the privilege to get to become an artist, who doesn't, but looking pretty exclusively at that point at gender. And then also looking at artists like Rosa Bonheur that you see there on the left with her incredible, also huge, massive painting in New York, The Horse Fair, which won her all kinds of accolades in her own time, of the few women who have been recognized as having a professional career, and how was it that they were able to kind of get around the systems that were built against women's ability to even compete as a professional artist in that moment. So both Nochlin and Clark wrote about, Manet's Olympia, for example, through very different lenses, but again, looking at issues of labor, of class, of what we call kind of the politics of vision, to quote the title of one of Linda Nochlin's books from the early 90s. It's on my shelf still, one of my undergrad books. And this idea of, who is the artist? Of course, we assume that when we say artist, we assume it's a man. And when we say he's painting and it's a painting of a nude, and you don't have to look at the picture to probably automatically assume that it's a woman. And these are things, of course, that are baked into us socially, culturally. It's not a given, but really exploring that for the first time, criticizing it, unpacking it, pulling it apart. So these are some of the many approaches. I'm kind of boiling it down. But that was a big trend in social art history, and you can look at it in a lot of different ways. And what came out of that moment in universities and academia, at least in the museum world, of how this would have filtered out to a more general public, might have informed collecting trends or the kind of exhibitions we might put on. We see in the exhibitions, again, that start coming out in the 70s and go through the late 90s or early 2000s. So I'm showing you just a few covers of exhibition catalogs from this period that came out. And what we get is kind of a slate of a lot of revisionist shows. So within Impressionism, there's almost a rediscovery of Gustave Caillebotte, who was considered to be kind of the wealthy dandy who purchased the artwork of his friends and donated it to the state. You can see the heart at the Musée d'Orsay of his collection. It really forms the heart of that Impressionist collection. But he gets reevaluated in an exhibition as a very important figure in this movement that till then had kind of been left out. You get exhibitions like the Montréal Impressionist show that was in 1987, and as you all well know, that was the only show that had been held in the U.S. essentially until our exhibition on Montréal that was held here in 2019. We get exhibitions like the origins of Impressionism, so trying to expand on that. You know, who were the artists that set this in motion? This wasn't, again, just a movement that sprung from the genius of these few artists at the time, that there was a build-up to the interest and that they're part of a continuum, not just emerging on their own. Or looking at artists like Monet and starting to consider either periods of production that had not been appreciated before, maybe Monet in the 90s, or maybe even more Monet in the 20th century. And it's a trend that continues today, in which we really love to kind of dial down into every decade, into every theme, and I love a good focus show. I just had the great fortune of seeing Monet and the Thames, his series, recently at the Curatorial in London, but we get shows on Monet at Argenteuil, you know, looking at every little aspect. So we expand out, and then we really allow ourselves to kind of do a deeper dive. One of the other trends that has emerged, I'd say, in the last 25 years is related to the art market and the formation of collections, and specifically the roles that dealers played, and frankly continue to play, in creating a brand and inspiring demand for certain kinds of artists or moments or movements where none may have previously existed. So I'm showing you again sort of a few titles up and down from left to right that kind of take you on the course from, let's say, 1997 to as recently as 2019 in the upper right-hand corner, where we're looking at the artists, Degas and Caillebotte, again, their collections. So kind of expanding our understanding of them as artists and patrons, or dealers like Ambroise Vollard or Durand-Ruel, who literally created an audience and a market for collecting this material with Durand-Ruel here in the US in particular. So that's been another big trend. So I'm going to come back to the first question that I started this with, which is, so what's there new left to be said and done? We started small, we expanded outward, we focused on individuals, we've sliced it into decades, themes, places, and in some ways too, I'm showing you here 2 reviews, snippets, screenshots, if you will, that really is a case in point. Because of course this isn't the first time that we've celebrated an anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition that was held in 1874. In 1974, the Metropolitan Museum was one of many, just like this moment now, where we are one of many, to celebrate that 100-year anniversary of that first exhibition in 1874. And I like to kind of compare it in a way, and I'm going to be very boring and read you a long quote, but I just love it because it's so blistering and so perfect and kind of surprising ultimately, as it wasn't that long ago. But it really captures what's summarized very neatly in the New York Times very recently with the review of the exhibition called 1874, The Birth of the Impressionist Moment, that's on view now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., where Jason Farrago is really trying to make the point of, like, it's radical, but how do we get people past this assumption that they know what it is? I love that he pulls in schmaltz, this idea that they're still misunderstood, and how do we get people to appreciate Impressionism and not just think of it as just more flowery, pretty schmaltz, if you will. That's not a new question, in fact. So bear with me. I think it's worth reading in the sense that it sort of summarizes maybe better than I just did, I think, the reaction to new approaches and forms of Impressionism, and also what one expects when they see an Impressionist show. So Hilton Kramer, in December of 1974, wrote a review of that Met show in the New York Times. The title already sort of says something, which I think hurts curators a little bit. We always have the battle of the labels and the text and how to approach that. But the title of the article is, "It is the text that rules in this textbook of an exhibition." Just to give you some sense already of where he might be going with this. So he says, "The Impressionist epic," which is the title of that show, "is something new in the way of a major art exhibition. Although mounted as an anniversary celebration of the first of the independent shows organized by the Impressionist painters in Paris 100 years ago, this exhibition is not primarily concerned to elucidate the Impressionist aesthetic. It is certainly not a carefully selected anthology of Impressionist masterpieces. It contains a great many remarkable pictures, but quite a few of them are not really Impressionist pictures. And the primary emphasis of the exhibition is, in any case, on the epic, rather than on the art. And the epic is conceived in terms of social history, in terms of rivalry of power, of manners and taste, of contending traditions and cultural combat. The old conviction that a painting has the power to speak for itself, that in other words, a museum is something different from a classroom, is all but abandoned. What we are offered then in the Impressionist epic is both a revisionist view of art history and a radically revised notion of the best way to exhibit works of visual art to the museum public. The view of art history that dominates is deeply suspicious of all aesthetic absolutes, and therefore abjures the championship of artistic heroism in favor of a more," his quotes, "judicious, even-handed embrace of both genius and mediocrity." Thus, along with the established heroes of Impressionism, Manet, Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Cézanne, we are also given a glimpse of their academic antagonists, Gérôme, Bastien Lepage, and sundry other cadavers from the morgue of the official salon. Make no mistake about it, this is a shift of considerable significance. Only an age that has had its faith in the absolute value of artistic excellence severely shaken could countenance such a flagrant apostasy. I mean, I love this because it sounds like it could have been written in 1874, just kind of like modernized 100 years later. It's like so radical and so dangerous. Come to the show and see these things. And also the idea of putting Gérôme, who showed at the Salon in 74, in the same exhibition of what's being shown by the Independents, which is being done now in DC. I believe that's the comparison you see when you walk in. Is still something that we did, and yet we still have to kind of continue to do. So that I think is a good way for me to turn it over to our first panelist this evening to kind of come up and give us his approach, knowing that these same criticisms, these same challenges have been dragging us now for some time. I would like to give a brief introduction of André again before I invite him to come up here and chat. And as you'll see, the format tonight is that once he does his presentation, we will have a discussion amongst ourselves. We will move down the line, and we hope to have time at the end for some of your questions and discussion as well. André Dombrowski is the Francis Shapiro-Weitzenhoffer Professor of 19th Century European Art in the Department of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. I thought I had a long title. That is a mouthful. He is the author of Cézanne, Murder and Modern Life, and his second monograph, Monet's Minutes, Impressionism and the Industrialization of Time, locates the rise of the Impressionist instant in the period's innovative time technologies and forms of time management. André has written on many other subjects and influential artists like Manet, Degas, Pissarro, and Menzel, although we should talk about Menzel. I don't think we talk about him nearly enough, among many, many others. He's also served as one of the co-editors of the large-scale 2021 volume, Cézanne in the Barnes Foundation, and is the editor of the Companion to Impressionism, which was published in 2021, which really takes a look at all of this research, methodologies, approaches, and it's why he was the perfect person to ask and also the perfect person to invite here to kick us off tonight. Thanks. Come on up, André.
Thank you, Nikki, so much. Thank you. Yes, I did that. And good evening. Thank you all for coming out on such a lovely day. It's such a pleasure to come to Dallas. The museum is amazing. I've enjoyed the morning walking through the exhibition, which is just stupendous. So congratulations to having this amazing art in town. I want to thank the museum for the invitation and for organizing this panel, to Nikki Myers for the invitation, and to Shelby Bennett and Shannon Linker for organizing and bringing us all together. Really wonderful. I was asked to present a little bit of my recent work on Impressionism in the context of some methodological debates that are currently occurring. I warn you now, this will feel a little bit like art historical speed dating. So just bear with me, and obviously the success of this will depend on how you feel about speed dating in general. Here it goes. I want to start by stressing one thing that is often said about Impressionism, which is that it is the style that focused painting on the here and now. And that is obviously a very common framing of the style, but I often tell my students that it's really important to think to the end of the radicality of this proposition. What do I mean by that? Right? That we need to afford to the Impressionist an understanding of the complexities of vision and embodiment as we take it for granted for ourselves. That being in a body and having a body and seeing through a body was as complex in the 19th century as we experience it in our own moment. The same holds true for what kind of contemporaneity that complexly embodied figure can face, and how layered we perceive that contemporaneity and that present to be. I hope we all agree that we in our own moment think of the present as this immensely layered, complicated entity with unknown futures, right? We really don't know what tomorrow will bring. And the Impressionists lived their present similarly. Right? And I really want us to remember that. This is not, and I want to stress this, a desire to bring our concerns into the 19th century, but it is a desire to understand the present of the Impressionists in as layered and complex terms as we want our present to be understood. In that regard, I want to start with an exhibition that's actually on at this moment in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay called Caillebotte Painting Men. It is one of the first exhibitions that takes into account questions of masculinity in Impressionist painting. The way men dress, the way men behave, the way men act, the way men interact at sports, and the like. And Caillebotte is the perfect subject for this because if I have the numbers correctly, 70% of his models were male, which, if you've been to other Impressionist exhibitions and know even a little bit about the other Impressionists, often that figure is reversed, if not more so, on their part. So it is a wonderful example of expanding questions of gender in Impressionist studies. For the catalog, I wrote a contribution on Caillebotte painting naked men and nude men, which again, if you know the work of Degas, I'm just comparing one of his pastels on the bottom to one of Caillebotte's bathers. You will see immediately the interesting gender switching that occurs here in terms of who is chosen to be the depicted bather. And I do see a new trend in general, which grew out of feminist art history, in conceiving of gender in more fluid terms in Impressionism. And there is a group of younger scholars and new scholarship that thinks in particular about gender switching, about gender fluidity, sexual fluidity in Impressionism. Alexander Morrison here on the left has written this very important article about a painter who, his name is Jacques François, who exhibited with the Impressionists in the first exhibition and several others. Well, it turns out that this Jacques François, and I presume we would have all, and art history thought for 150 years that Jacques François was a man. No, Jacques François was in fact the Marquise de Rambure, and exhibiting under a male pseudonym. And then there's also some new scholarship in trans studies. Rachel Mesh has published this amazing book called Before Trans, and several of the figures and writers she discusses in it are also deeply connected to the Impressionist movement. In particular, there I'm showing you a photo of Marie-Amélie Chartroul de Montifaux, who is in art historical circles better known as Marc de Montifaux, who was a very prominent critic. Marc wrote one of the most famous early criticisms of Cézanne, for instance. You may have heard that in 1874, a critic, this is Marc de Montifaux, said that all these Cézannes are really painted on hashish, because the Cézanne's early work is a rather an interesting thing. So there is one new trend in seeing questions of gender and sexuality in somewhat more fluid terms. You may think that is tangential to the Impressionists themselves. Well, think again, because on the right there you're seeing a very little known photograph of Gustave Caillebotte in women's clothing from 1868 that is in the Caillebotte family album. And some of the better known photographs of Toulouse-Lautrec in drag may be more familiar, right? But the connections are definitely there. And obviously we have only begun to scratch the surface of the gender fluidity of figures in Gauguin's work and some of the other painters of his generation. A second and third broad theme in recent scholarship has to do with questions of industrialization, globalization, and colonization. When earlier generations of social art historians were looking at Impressionism, they often focused on questions of leisure, questions of fashion, and questions of consumption. You may remember the amazing exhibition in Chicago a few years ago, Impressionism and Fashion, for instance. There has been a lot of literature on the food items and food consumption in Impressionism and the like. But over the last couple of decades and years, the fact that Impressionism is a style of and for the Industrial Revolution, I think, has been taken a little bit more seriously than it has been in the past. To prove this point, I'm just showing you this Pizarro of this prominent factory outside of Pontoise. Some examples here include these books. Laura Kalba has a few years ago published a book called Color in the Age of Impressionism, in which she thought about the relationship between Impressionism and the industrialization of color, the emergence of chemical colors, mauve, magenta, and so on, and the broader heightened color sense of the 19th century and how it, in fact, infiltrated the kind of heightened and those stunning colors of the Impressionist and post-Impressionist generation. Holly Clayson has done a similar study on light in Impressionism and in the late 19th century, in the Belle Epoque, what it meant to have electric lighting for the first time, so that what we have so long presumed to be nothing but natural light, right, sunlight, over and over and over in Impressionism, was actually a much more vectored and layered forms of artificial lightings and new lighting technologies of gas and electric lighting that the Impressionists were much, much more sensitive to than a previous generation had acknowledged. My own work fits into this this category as well. So the book that Nikki mentioned just a minute ago on Monet's Minutes is asking into the genesis of the Impressionist instant, and what an instant actually as a temporal category meant in the 19th century, and how it related to wholesale changes in our attitudes towards time. Living with train schedules. Universal time was invented in the 1880s, in the middle of Monet's career. Right? Greenwich became prime meridian, and the time zones were invented, and the like. And the argument here is that regimentation and regularization of time put pressure on the Impressionist instant and almost made it more poetic, made it more unique, made it more special every time it occurred, precisely because time was regularizing all around it. Just some quick examples, like that when Monet painted the Rouen Cathedral facades, he was basically looking at a clock that was on the center of that facade while he was painting, and that beautiful little yellow disc that centers all these versions is in fact a clock. I've recently extended that line of inquiry into Monet's trip to Venice. There's going to be a beautiful show of Monet in Venice next year at the Brooklyn Museum. And when Monet is in Venice in 1908, he actually paints according to the most stringent schedule you will have ever encountered. And Alice Monet writes to her daughter about it. At 8 o'clock, he is here. At 10 o'clock, he is here. At 2 o'clock, he paints here. And at 4 o'clock, he is here. Every single day. And she writes to her daughter, our life here in Venice is very well regulated. Well, that is not a letter I write from the Jersey Shore, when I'm bathing, like what a terrible holiday card to write, And so I've been thinking about what that regulation of time has something to do with the way in which repetition functions in the series paintings. The other big topic in current Impressionist studies is global Impressionism and globalization. This takes several forms. Impressionism arose in a truly global age of global transport, global communications. We all know, Gauguin ended up in Tahiti somehow, right? And he ended up there because of travel schedules that were newly industrialized. But Impressionism too traveled globally. And they were not just collectors all over the world, but also painters who slowly, by the late 19th century, adopted Impressionist tendencies in the various local schools. On the left is a painting by Kuroda Seiki, the Japanese painter who brought French and Western painting techniques to Japan, and you can see how infiltrated and infused they are by Impressionist protocols. So we have several volumes of late globalizing Impressionism, mapping Impressionist painting in a transnational context that have asked this particular question: how did Impressionism become a global phenomenon in the late 19th century? Obviously, paintings like this one in the show of this beautiful still life of Chinese porcelains and Chinese lacquerware. And I'm not quite sure if that sage plant is a local French-grown plant. Obviously, we can't begin to understand the economic and the global exchange in this painting without asking ourselves the questions I just posed. Related to this is a decolonial approach to Impressionism, in particular new questions around what models of African descent are depicted in Impressionism. You saw Olympia earlier, and on the right there next to Olympia is a model named Lore of African descent, and Denise Morel's work on Black models has been really central. So has Darcy Grimaldo-Grigsby's, who's recently published this book on the right called Creole, in which she thinks about Creole subjects in the 19th century. There's a big chapter on Degas in New Orleans and his Creole family. In the book, a scholar named C.C. McKee has really interestingly thought about Pizarro's origins in the Danish Caribbean and the way in which an imperial system is in early Pizarro's work. Again, some pictures in the show, right, about how Pizarro thinks of himself as a non-French citizen, I think are interesting to think about in terms of his paintings, still life with Spanish peppers. On the left, unthinkable without, I think, this particular context. So last couple of thoughts. The text I'm writing right now, I'm presenting actually at the end of the week at a conference in Chapel Hill, also on Impressionism. It's a big Impressionism here, right? So there are lots of things going on. I have started to think a little bit about processes of wasting and reconceptualizations of trash in the 1860s and 70s. So I've started to look a little bit at Manet's still lifes and the very idea that he's the painter who just randomizes everything, right? That here's a lemon over here and there's that, and nothing really makes sense. No meal makes sense. At the very moment when the trash can is invented and Monsieur Poubelle really invents the very idea of trash and trashing. And so I'm thinking a little bit about the connections there, which are counterpoints to some of the ideas about consumption that I mentioned earlier. So I'll leave it at that. Probably a lot of questions and other things to think about, but keep reading, keep looking at Impressionism, about Impressionism. I think those painters and those paintings are not going to stop giving, you know, for some time. So thank you.
It's coming. Here we go. Thank you so much for that. That was great speed dating. I would have liked to have spent time with all of these potential suitors. I guess it's good that we're mid-career, right? We've got time to dig into all these. But I think one of the things that I often think about that I'd love to pose to this group, and to in particular, given what you brought up initially at the top of your talk about Caillebotte, in this idea of sort of gender identity as being kind of a new trend and looking at it, I just would love to know what you all feel is our responsibility as art historians, as scholars, when looking backwards, as much as we don't want to project our contemporary values, our thoughts, our language, our terminology, our definitions, you know, onto times past. At the same time, there are things that are there that we see. I always give Rosa Bonheur as the example of an artist who got permission from the police to wear pants so that she could go to the horse fair and study the animals, or go to the abattoir to study, you know, animals as they were being broken down into carcasses, because that was man's territory, and a skirt would have slowed her down. Cut her hair short, very much like mine, in fact, but what was then considered to be a man's hairstyle. And when you see photographs of her, you know, very much, if you were to, you would think that she was dressing perhaps through our modern eyes and presenting herself as a man. But at the end, we know that she had young companions who lived with her. We can conjecture about the nature of their relationships, but for example, the great Rosa Bonheur show that finally happened at the Orsay 2 years ago now or so, and I felt it was very bold in a way of applying language like she's a lesbian, just saying it straight out when this isn't a word that the artist herself used, and that might have still had a meaning that was more nuanced at the time, even for this artist, who at time, you know, also presented in a dress and posed, et cetera, et cetera. So I've often wondered that, like, how much is it to point out what's there? Like, what's our responsibility as historians of what we can think we know as fact, versus where's the fine line of going that extra step to put a label on something to open up a new way of thinking? Big question, but it's something I actually genuinely would love to know, because I struggle with this.
Well, I think it's one of the things that the Caillebotte show does really well. You said it, André, well, many things so well, one being that these paintings are not going to stop giving, and I believe profoundly that that pictures always have more stories to tell. But also, as you mentioned, just the sheer fact that Caillebotte, 70% of his models, excuse me, were men is really shocking that this has not been brought to light before. And I think what the show does well is point out this fact and open onto it without forcing a label on Caillebotte. There are questions there that one can ask, and I think that's the responsible thing to do, is to shed light on aspects of these artist practices that might not have been seen, but not imposing upon them what might be contemporary viewpoints and social mores. And I think that the show like that one, it opens onto these questions without saying that Caillebotte was this or that, because fundamentally we just don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Mary-Dailey. And to your question, I think there are two answers. Number one, that we don't have to look at the past with our particular notions. Obviously, that is partly unavoidable, and some of the kind of ways we look at the past is inflected by our contemporary issues. But even though there is no language that is related to transgender studies or to post-1970 forms of thinking around sexuality, the 19th century is full of interesting gender-fluid practices, sexual practices that had different names, that spoke different languages, that used different terminology, but that were nonetheless there. Just the other day I read about a court case that started in 1866 and made its way through the French Supreme Court and ended in 1874, of a man who lived in southern France who was asking for a divorce from a person who was intersex in the contemporary terms. This was a huge court case that was all over the news all the time for 7 years. These are, even though the words are not there, the issues are absolutely there. And I think it's our responsibility as scholars to be historically specific and sensitive as to, so even though there is no they pronoun in the 1860s and 70s, the way this case is described is with an immense fluidity between male and female pronouns, right? They're just being used simultaneously and so on. So being sensitive to those things, I think, is important. The second answer has to do with, I am very much a scholar who wants to let the paintings and their particular erotics, if we want to call it that, or their particular forms of libidinal desire speak, right? So even if Caillebotte painted two men drying themselves after bathing, why do we need to presume that this has anything to do with Caillebotte at all? It's just two paintings, you know? And maybe what he was after was a sense of disrupting this tradition that just made bathing such a female subject in modern life painting. And I think we can leave it at that and let the paintings speak to the desires they then unleash, even without Caillebotte perfectly controlling or instigating those desires in the first place.
I think it also kind of points out how superficial it is that we don't question how natural it is for women to paint women. I'm glad you ended on the Cassatt. I was going to put up Morisot nudes. Morisot and Cassatt, for propriety's sake, had to hire the same female model to paint the nude together at the same time. So probably almost 99% of their output are subjects that are women, and we don't question that at all. So it's kind of a fun foil to have up right now.
I think it's also interesting that, and so great that we can ask these questions today. You know, I mean, so many of the questions that are brought up in the books that you've shown about gender fluidity at the time weren't being asked, 50 years ago. And I think that's something that is really exciting, to have the openness and the freedom to discover an aspect that is less well known about this history through these lenses, without, again, presuming certain things about the artists in their time.
All right, I will point out that we have one work that we know of in our Historic European collection by a trans artist, that their name is Anton Prinner, and is a sculpture, which is also really fascinating, but is an artist that was assigned female at birth in our collection and was in Picasso's circle. And so even sculpture at that point is fascinating work. Upstairs on level 2, there's my plug, come back when we're open, upstairs. With that, to keep us moving, because I know we started a little bit late, I'm going to introduce Genevieve Westerby, who will then give a talk at the podium. So Genevieve is a doctoral candidate at the University of Delaware, studying European art of the long 19th century. Prior to pursuing her graduate studies, she was a researcher in the European painting and sculpture of art, European art, at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she did research and supported exhibitions on Manet and modern beauty, and Gauguin, artist as alchemist, among others, in addition to co-editing the online scholarly catalogs of the works by Manet, Gauguin, Caillebotte, and Pissarro in Chicago's collection. Genevieve's dissertation examines late 19th century French landscape painting in the context of river engineering and its ecological effects. This new trend in scholarship, which I have learned from Genevieve, is now called eco-criticism. That's how new this is what she'll be speaking to us on right now. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to echo Andre's kind words of thanks. Thanks to the museum, and thanks to Nikki for inviting me and including me in this fantastic panel with these great scholars. And thank you all to you to joining us today on this Tuesday evening. And I guess let me advance maybe. Yes, I guess if André gave us a speed dating overview of art history, I'm going to do maybe a first date into this realm of eco-criticism. I thought it might be helpful to give us a bit of background to start off, just to give us a foundation to build on. So what is eco-criticism? It's kind of tricky to succinctly define, but in a Western context, eco-criticism finds its roots largely in the 19th century, with thinkers like Élisée Reclus and George Perkins Marsh, who I have some of their texts here on the far left, who challenged the general belief that the impact of humans on nature was negligible and benign. And building on Charles Darwin's work, the Prussian scientist Ernst Haeckel first coined the term ecology in 1866 in this text I have in the middle there. And eco-criticism as a practice today grew largely out of the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s, which many have argued was launched by Rachel Carson's important work, Silent Spring, that I have there on the far right. And the term itself, eco-criticism, it's first cropped up in the 1990s as a literary theory that examines the changing relationship between humans, non-human animals, and the environment. And in art history, the focus is obviously on visual and material culture, but the goal is largely the same. And on the right, I'm just showing you a few fairly recent publications in the field. If you're so inspired that you want to do a deep dive into eco-critical art history. To give us a bit of a working definition, we can think of eco-criticism as an approach that first and foremost tries to decenter humans as the focus and critically illuminates the environmental context of cultural objects, particularly in our moment of climate change and catastrophic weather events. Eco-criticism further entails ethical and often activist dimensions and draws connections between past environmental history and our concerns of our present day. So scholars are increasingly turning to an eco-critical framework to study the art of 19th century France. And any survey of the scholarship, even the very abbreviated one that I'll give you here, tends to begin with Greg Thomas, who studied the entangled relationship between art and ecology in the 19th century through the landscapes of Theodore Rousseau. Thomas framed Rousseau's compositions as ecological for their focus on the organic unity of nature, where humans, if they're included at all, were generally intruders in an otherwise cohesive landscape. And with pictures like this one that I have on the right, Thomas highlights how Rousseau felt about the deforestation that he witnessed firsthand and his fight to preserve sections of the forest at Fontainebleau. I think I have, a nice detail here. I just want to highlight the title here. The Massacre of the Innocents was one that Rousseau gave to the picture himself. And so between both image and text, Rousseau is explicitly raising awareness about the role of industrialization that played on the destruction of the forest. Not many artists, however, were as outspoken or explicitly concerned with the environment as Rousseau was in the 19th century. And so a question that I get sometimes, and I think this might speak to what some might see as a drawback of the method, kind of goes to the question that Nikki was just talking a little bit about just a moment ago, is the question of its intentionality. Did the artist intend for their works to be viewed in this eco-critical way? And I think we can see this in Monet's London series that I have here on the right, an example of. Monet was drawn to London to capture the extraordinary chromatic light effects that resulted from the city's unique atmospheric conditions, but as Jonathan Ribner argued in his 2004 article, these light effects required smog, and this combination of fog and coal fire emissions was not just disruptive to daily life, but deadly in the late 19th century. And while Monet didn't seem that concerned with the ill effects of fog, he didn't mention it in his letters home at least, Ribner nonetheless argues that this series can and should be seen as visual evidence of London's environmental degradation. And just one last example here on my little quick survey. I mentioned that one of eco-criticism's goals is to decenter humans, and so another active focus in eco-critical art history is animal studies. And Katie Hornstein's work, I think, is a good example of this in practice. Through examples like Jericho's portrait of a lioness that I have for you here on the right, she takes on the subject of lions, but wants to reconsider them as more than just merely symbols or passive subjects in art, and instead focuses on the individual lives of these lions and places their depiction in the context of the societal change and colonial expansion of post-revolutionary France. For me, eco-critical art history means asking questions about the environment first. So in my current research project, as Nikki mentioned, I've been studying Impressionist landscapes in the context of river engineering and its ecological effects. So tonight, I'd like to focus on a few landscapes by Alfred Sisley and Armand Guillemot that depict piles of sand as a bit of a case study to talk about how taking an eco-critical approach allows us to see these pictures in a new way. So when you think of modernization of France in the 19th century, you might think about the introduction of railways or factories burning coal, but the extraction of sand was actually just as essential. With the construction of locks and dams and canals, civil engineers transformed the rivers of France into a predictable and reliable transportation network. And I'm showing you here the location of 9 dams that were built along the Seine between Paris and Rouen in the middle part of the century. To maintain navigability and to keep this infrastructure operational, engineers regularly ordered campaigns of river dredging. Depending on the engineer's goals, the work might be carried out by large mechanical dredging boats, or it could be carried out manually by teams of contractors like those in Sisley's picture that I'm showing you here. The artist painted scenes in and around the rural village of Port Marly throughout the 1870s, often featuring activities that powered the local economy. But in this case, Sisley calls attention to the extractive process of sand dredging. Here, a series of doubled motifs guide us through the picture, from the 2 sand piles resting on the bank in the foreground, past the twinned anchoring poles, and onto a pair of 2-man dredging teams working in the middle ground. The artist provides a visual link between the work required to keep the river navigable and the material that resulted from their labor. And while the primary aim of this dredging was to facilitate navigation, the extracted sand itself was increasingly valuable. With the construction boom that accompanied George Eugene Haussmann's redesign of Paris beginning in the 1850s, the demand for sand quickly outstripped what river maintenance projects could supply. Entrepreneurs took advantage of this growing market and started to operate on an industrial scale in the Seine River Valley to the southeast of Paris. Dredging companies began to purchase or rent large tracts of land that they turned into sprawling sand pits. To take just one example, the company Montréal purchased roughly 20 acres near Croisy-le-Roi in 1878, where they established a pit. Workers first removed up to 30 feet of soil in this alluvial plain to reach the sand deposits below the waterline. A small channel was dug to connect their pit to the Seine that we can see in the image on the top left here, through which tons of extracted sand were transported on barges to the quays of Paris for processing and sale, which we can see happening in the middle image here. And they relied on steam-powered mechanical dredgers like the one featured at the bottom to extract sand quickly and cheaply. The impact the first 25 years of their mining had on the landscape is clear in the 1903 map I have on the right, in which the large amorphous shape of their pit extends perpendicularly to the Seine. Evidence of this type of industrial scale extraction was a recurring theme in the work of Armand Guillemin. Perhaps a lesser-known Impressionist, he developed his landscape style while working alongside Camille Pissarro and Paul Cézanne in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and his pictorial choices similarly tended to focus on working-class labor and growing signs of industrialization. However, Guillemin's work more directly reveals the mechanized heavy industry that was increasingly visible in the outskirts of Paris, such as in the work I have on the left here for you, in which the artist depicts the billowing smoke that emanated from the forges at Ivry set against the sky at sunset. Guillemin also pictured the heavy machinery and backbreaking labor that sustained the increasingly industrialized sand supply chain. It was in part thanks to the artist's proximity to the subject. The picture that I have on the right here, we see a towering pile of sand on the edge of the Quai d'Anjou, which was mere steps from Guillemin's Paris studio. On other occasions, the artist walked further upriver to the Quai de Bercy or would take the train out to Ivry, sites where industrial-scale sand merchants, including Montréal, unloaded their barges. We can see this work underway in the pastel that I have on the left, in which a large steam-powered crane is offloading sand from a barge onto the bank nearby. I'm just realizing I didn't really bring a detail, but hopefully you might not be able to see, but on the side of the crane there, Guillemin wrote in the name Montréal on blue there and white. And then on the right, we have a worker who's sifting sand on the banks of the Seine at Ivry. So proximity to dredged sand is one possible explanation for Guillemin's interest in this subject. Free models these work sites provided is another. As the only Impressionist to consistently hold a job to support his art making, Guillemin may have also had an affinity for the work underway at these sites. He was born in Paris in 1841, but he grew up in central France and then returned to the capital as a teenager to work in his uncle's shop. By the late 1860s, he took a job with the Pont de Chaussée, which was the department in charge of public works, digging ditches 3 nights a week. This position paid relatively well and allowed him to paint during the day. Like Guillemin's work digging ditches, that of his models was equally grueling, also low paid and often dangerous. The largely itinerant and immigrant workforce employed by Montréal, for example, endured 14 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week. So these bright Impressionist landscapes by Guillemin and Sicily therefore clearly testified the hardship of working-class labor. However, if we try and refocus our attention, decenter humans, as it were, and focus that attention on the sand itself, these pictures also reveal the exploitation of a non-renewable resource. As engineer and sand expert Michael Wayland has reminded us, quote, industrial sand production relies largely on the work of rivers, eroding, transporting, sorting, and dumping deposits of an attractive commercial quantity and quality of sand, end quote. And it's important to remember that this work happens on a geologic timescale. Indeed, even by the late 19th century, some already observed that sand was being removed from the Seine at an unsustainable rate, and that the remaining supply of usable sand was quickly diminishing. It was one of the reasons that Morion Corville and other companies went to the trouble of opening sand pits. By the early 20th century, an engineer noted in a trade journal that, quote, "These sands of good quality are difficult to extract, most especially in the Paris region. The Seine has almost been completely dredged," end quote. With this observation, we are reminded of the accelerated depletion of sand in the latter part of the 19th century. In choosing piles of sand as a painterly subject, I hope we can begin to see how Cicely and Guillemin's landscapes reveal the degree to which the Seine was being mined to exhaustion. Guillemin, in particular, highlighted the staggering volume of sand he observed on the quays of Paris. He returned to this subject time and again over the course of 3 decades, depicting piles of sand in nearly 60 works, including paintings, drawings, and pastels. In his work, this natural resource is waiting to be processed into a commodity and become an integral and irretrievable component of the built environment. Just to close here, over 120 years later, barges filled with sand can still be found moored to the quays of Paris. Today, sand is the second most exploited natural resource in the world after water, and as was the case in the rapidly industrializing and modernizing Paris of the 19th century, the city's current demand, its insatiable appetite for sand, as this article in Lemmon puts it, continues to outpace the available sources for this resource. We need it today for everything from concrete and asphalt and glass to silicon for computer chips, and it continues to be extracted from riverbeds, banks, and floodplains around the globe. Local French advocates and international environmental experts agree that the continued availability and environmental impact of sand extraction is an urgent local and global issue. So studying pictures by Cicely and Guillemin from an eco-critical perspective, I think encourages us to reflect on how and where we have extracted sand historically and on our continued exploitation of it today. So thank you.
Thank you. You asked my burning question, which is, what are they doing with all this sand? Vast being one of them, and even today now with technology, I find that fascinating. I think for those of us who live in Dallas, seeing all the cranes, it really kind of brings it home in the sense that we're constantly seeing them here, and just when you think they're all gone, they pop back up, and how much is part of an environment, what you were describing, André, when you first started out about this experience, what you see, what's part of your life, like what you choose. I'm sort of struck by the fact, Genevieve, that there's such an interesting formal quality, to speak of formalism, about the color, about the shape, knowing that there's quarries of rock that are also being dug out in this period in different parts of Paris, like in Montmartre, for example, that there's multiple sites of construction around Paris in this moment. What do you make of that, even just beyond some of the things that you laid out of maybe what the attraction was for an artist like Guillemin, but what do you think there's something there about just how it looks, this like golden piles that look like haystacks?
Definitely, yes, and that's something that I think about kind of in a larger form of this project, the kind of, the formal qualities that you can see. I think that's definitely, there's something there, this kind of contrast of the yellow and the blue of the river, that's, definitely of interest, I think, to Guillemin. But I think, I like to, it's a bit speculative, but I think that there is something about the pile of sand and the way that it tumbles down, and the grains of sand, kind of are always fleetingly moving about or something like that, that maybe that was attractive to Guillemin as well, as an impressionist that's interested in these fleeting moments and capturing nature, as they experience it, that maybe the sand, had something to say to him in that regard as well.
It's reflective too.
Yeah.
It might not be captured in the paintings,
Yeah.
but yeah, it'd be sparkling in a way looking at it. In the interest of time, I think maybe we want to invite Mary-Dailey to go to the podium. I am meant to speak a bit about conservation, but I think we might pass on that just to allow, again, more time for this panel to chat, and if there's any time to hear some of your questions too. So with that, I will introduce who will become our final speaker this evening, Mary-Dailey Desmarais, who is Chief Curator of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Mary-Dailey has been responsible for the reinstallation of the museum's modern and contemporary galleries and is currently overseeing major reinstallations of the museum's Inuit art collection and decorative arts and design pavilion. She's curated many exhibitions on many topics, from contemporary artists like Basquiat to 19th century painters like Signac in a project called Signac et les Indépendants. She's very active in her community, serving on lots of juries and art prizes, for example, in Canada, and again is published very widely on topics. But within the 19th century, wrote her dissertation looking at Monet's early career, and those of you might also be familiar with her name, and she contributed as an author to the Monet Early Years exhibition that was mounted at the Kimball several years back. So with that, I will invite you to go to the podium and give us a different look of what is it like to work on an artist like Monet, who is the quintessential Impressionist and symbol of this moment, especially, I think, as a curator. I think we often invite eye rolls when we say we're working on Monet, so I'm excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here with you and with these great panelists here this evening. And I also want to extend my personal thanks to the Dallas Museum of Art for the invitation here tonight to speak about my approach to Claude Monet and how it was that I came to work on this artist. Oh, am I going backwards? Hold on. How do I get to... There we go. Thank you. As we all know, it is Claude Monet whose name is most closely associated with Impressionism. After all, it was his painting, this painting, Impression Soleil Levant, of 1872, that earned the group their name after their first exhibition in 1874. Since that time, Monet's painting has become beloved for its shimmering and luminous depictions of sailboats in sunshine, poplars in pink, and water lilies floating on the surface of the Seine. Two beautiful examples from Dallas's collection on the screen here. His work is largely understood to be pleasant and popular, and thus prime material for so many a poster in dentist and doctor's office worldwide. And it's for this reason, and also, of course, for the fact that there had been so much great research already conducted on Monet by the time I got to graduate school, work to which mine is certainly indebted, that it felt to me almost taboo to consider writing on him as a dissertation topic. Actually, in fact, it's pretty much exactly what you are not supposed to do when you're writing a dissertation. In doing so, ideally, you're supposed to pick something obscure that's never written about, mine an archive, figure out something to say about it, and share it with the world. So in retrospect, writing about Monet was arguably a very bad idea. Why I decided to do it, anyway, your guess is probably as good as mine. But I suppose part of it had to do with the fact that I've always loved looking at Monet's painting, and I always felt intuitively that he was more than just an eye, as Cézanne famously said. But it wasn't until I was a teaching fellow for the 19th century scholar Carol Armstrong that I decided to devote serious study to his work. In the course of researching for that class, I came across so many paintings by Monet that didn't fit easily within standard discourse on his practice. Paintings of death and stillness and the interior that seemed to open on to the complexities and contradictions inherent in Monet's quest to capture light. These paintings became the heart of my work, and in the remaining time I have today, I would like to focus on one of them, because it seems to me to open on to what I believe is the melancholy at the heart of Monet's practice, which is the concept around which I'm actually in the process of developing an exhibition project. On September 5th, 1879, Monet's first wife, Camille Dancieux, succumbed to an illness that had plagued her for many years. Seated by her bedside, Monet set a canvas on an easel and painted her picture. Camille on her deathbed is the saddest painting Monet ever made. It is a painting about loss and a painting about death. It is a painting about the passing of a loved one, a wife and a mother. But Camille sur son lit de mort is also a painting about the process of death, or perhaps better said, about its duration. In Monet's own words, it's about the colors of death imposing on her immobile face. As it came to Camille, death was the color of snow in sunshine and rain in spring, and the color of tears on the side of his cheek. It was white and gray and pink and blue, and it clawed and caressed and clutched at Camille until she sank beneath the surface of the canvas. Passing his brush across her figure again and again and again, Monet buried Camille beneath the weight of his mark, and yet, at the same time, the clawing, frenzied movement of Monet's brush seems to want to pull Camille closer to the front of the picture plane, lending her a pulse that counteracts the stillness of her death. Neither here nor there, neither absent nor fully present, Camille was captured in the act of becoming a ghost. This painting also suggests something spectral at work in the act of painting itself. At the bottom of the image, right here, part of the raw canvas is exposed, calling attention to the process of Monet's painting unfolding over time. Each mark made in this process is at once an act of constitution of the image on the surface of the canvas and dissolution of the body of Camille. The closer Monet's brush comes to Camille, the more desperately his stroke appears to dig at her, the farther she fades from view. To paint, this picture tells us, is to make a ghost of what we see. And it's not just Camille who is relegated to the shadows in this image. In the upper right-hand corner, right there, you can maybe see the dot moving around. We can just barely make out a face. Is it the face of one of the two little boys Camille had left behind, her young sons, Michel and Jean? We cannot say for sure. His face, too, disintegrates in the surface of Monet's canvas. In Camille sur son lit de mort, the whole world of Monet's painting starts to dissolve. It is in the very real combination of life and death, presence and absence, possession and loss, that in this deathbed picture of her, Camille becomes the shadow of something bigger than herself, opening on to the dialectics of Monet's instant and of his particular historical moment. Standard discourse on Monet's practice has it that what took Monet from a painting like Bridge at Argenteuil, which you see on the screen, with a subject that was readily comprehensible to visitors, and later works, like his water lily paintings, which appeared to verge on abstraction, was a phenomenon whereby Monet's obsessive and even compulsive desire to capture what he saw in front of him gave way to an impulse to record his subjective experience of nature and to create a unified effect of light and atmosphere on canvas, what Monet called the envelope, the same light spread everywhere. Typically, this shift in Monet's practice is associated with Monet's work from the 1880s. Around this time, in the words of the late art historian John House, Monet's focus shifted from nature into art, subordinating topographical detail to surface unity. Camille sur son lit de mort seems to me a crucial painting in arriving at this point, for it is in this picture that for the first time, a specific topography, albeit the landscape of a human face, was completely submerged in an envelope of light and air and atmosphere. Monet's attention to the air surrounding Camille in this painting takes on new meaning when we consider that Camille on her deathbed was made at a time when the invisible air was the site of interrogation of the limits of human perception. In the course of working on this picture, I began to think about it in the context of contemporaneous debates about perception and period interest in the invisible air, linked in part to the development of photography, which scholar Terry Castle has rightly called, quote, the ultimate ghost-producing technology of the 19th century. I do not have time today to speak about all of the nuances of Monet's relationship to photography and to period debates about human perception. But suffice it to say that much like our own time, the 19th century experienced fundamental paradigm shifts that brought about a profound questioning of our ability to really know the world around us. My research in this area brought me to believe that Monet's increased attention to the invisible air in the years surrounding Camille's death was more than simply a matter of capturing light and air, and more than simply a record of Monet's experience. Rather, Monet's envelope is a figuration of the spectrality of the perception, a pictured recognition that the way in which we perceive objects is no more solid or stable than the skin of ghosts. Literature, particularly ghost stories, became an important source for me in this context. Monet was in fact an avid reader of ghost stories, and there are so many that one could cite. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to settle on just one, and it's Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, I can sure that you are saying to yourself, what? And Shakespeare's play, yes, predates Monet's painting of Camille by 3 centuries, but it was everywhere present in the years surrounding her death. I'm just throwing you on the screen a few examples of Hamlet-themed paintings that were around at the time that Monet painted his picture, or just before the time that Monet painted his picture of Camille on her deathbed. And I'm not the first to notice the similarity between that picture and this bronze relief that you see on the screen. It was in the context of contemporaneous concern with truth and the ability to accurately perceive it that Hamlet gained such currency in the 19th century. Think of something as seemingly banal as Hamlet's back and forth with Polonius about yonder cloud, now in the shape of a camel, now like a weasel, now like a whale. And so, as Gertrude asks of Hamlet, so too I think we should ask of Monet, alas, how is it with you that you do bend your eye on vacancy and with the incorporeal air do hold discourse? Just as Hamlet learns through the ghost that the question is not as simple as to be or not to be, that the truth lies in the space between the two, it is through Camille, or at least through his last painting of her, that Monet most clearly expresses an understanding that capturing the fleeting in what 19th century critic Jules Castagnari called a disintegrated age involves communion with the space that is not seen. In the last moments of her life, Camille must have made powerfully clear to Monet the impossibility of keeping close, of possessing through paint that which was beheld and experienced by the viewing subject. The spectrality of Camille in this picture is not just a sign of Monet's obsessive compulsion to capture the outside world, but also constitutes an interrogation of the limits of human perception, a coming to terms with what he referred to as the impossibility of his task. And I'm showing you on the screen paintings that he made just after Camille died. After he made this painting of Camille, Monet began to speak more consistently about his attention to the atmosphere in his paintings and to be more at ease with, although still frustrated by the impossibility of his task. In an interview conducted in 1891, Monet said, "For me, a landscape does not exist in its own right, since its appearance changes at every moment, but its surroundings bring it to life, the air and the light which vary continually." This statement was a far cry from what he had said in 1868 when he wrote to his best friend, Frédéric Bazille, "The further I go, the more I regret the little I know, and that's what bothers me the most, it's certain. Monet made his comment about the landscape not existing except for through its surroundings in the context of his inaugural exhibition in the spring of 1891 of grain stacks painted near his home in Giverny. For the critic Gustave Geffroy, in their scintillating light and what he called their phantasmagoric, another word for ghostly, quality, the paintings evoked Monet's, quote, regret of still and forever not being able to fix tumultuous cities, the movements of the sea, the solitude of the sky. But he knows also that an artist can pass his whole life in the same place, watching the world around him without exhausting the ever-changing spectacle. In addition to the grain sack paintings Monet showed in 1891, he also showed 2 figure paintings, one of which you see on the screen at right. The painting depicts Monet's stepdaughter, Suzanne Horchow, standing on a hillside wearing a white dress in a pose that directly recalls that held by Camille 8 years earlier in a painting called La Promenade, which you see on the left. According to Monet's stepson, Jean-Pierre Rochedet, one day, when Monet was returning from one of his painting sessions, he saw the ghost of Camille in the figure of Suzanne standing at the top of the hill. He cried, "But that's just like Camille at Argenteuil. Well, tomorrow you'll come back and you shall pose there." Suzanne was apparently made to pose for so many hours at a time that she fainted from exhaustion. This goes back to Monet's obsessive personality, if you will. With the obvious exception of the presence of Jean in La Promenade, what provides the most critical distinction between that painting and the paintings of Suzanne exhibited in 1891 is Monet's attention to the atmosphere at the expense of the distinguishing figures of the subject, who in the later work appears as a faceless ghost haunting the hillside. At the same time, it is precisely this spectral quality that allows for the memory of Camille to come through in the image. The painting is not so distinctly Suzanne as to prevent us from imagining her in the context of Camille. Fittingly, the celebrated writer Octave Mirbeau referred to this image as wraith-like as Lady Ligeia, the title character of Edgar Allan Poe's anonymous story. This comparison was especially apt, not just because Suzanne, like Ligeia, appeared both real and phantom, but also because the climax of the story occurs when the ghost of the narrator's deceased first wife, Ligeia, appears in the body of his second wife, Rowena, at the moment of her death, an apt counterpart to the specter of Camille in Monet's later pictures. Just as Camille haunted Monet's paintings exhibited in 1891, we might also see something of Camille lingering in Monet's paintings of cathedrals. The somber blues and grays of this picture call to mind the coloring of Camille Saint-Saëns. And seen in the context of Camille, the cathedral portal takes on the character of a featureless face that seems to call forth her memory. For me, the clock above the first portal that you see on the left here echoes the pendant around Camille's neck, the barely visible circle, which you can see here, of lighter white in the center of the composition in Camille sur son lit de mort, although Monet certainly never spoke in such terms. In the process of making the cathedral paintings, Monet did, however, write, "Everything changes, even stone," and in a separate letter stated, "I add and I lose, I'm looking for the impossible." This last remark is often interpreted as a sign of frustration, but we might also read these words as an affirmation, a deliberate embrace of the impossible space of slippage between the present and the past, between the material object and the magic of the experience of it. And so when I think about the melancholy of Monet's larger enterprise, it is not only related to the sadness of certain of his subjects, like Camille on her deathbed. Despite my interest in the way she haunts his later pictures, certainly my goal is not to claim that all of his work is somehow related to her. Rather, I'm interested in Monet's consistent address, and this from his earliest years, to what he knew was already gone. And in closing, I would like to turn to a photograph of Monet taken in Venice in 1908, which, for me, encapsulates this view. In this photograph, Monet stands in the middle of St. Mark's Square. Next to him is Alice Horchow, whom he married after Camille's death in 1892. Monet and Alice are surrounded by pigeons. One is perched on Monet's head, and another has landed on his hand. A third is outside his grasp, hovering on the edge of the picture. The bird was moving too fast for Monet to capture, and too fast for the camera too, so its body registers as a mere blur. It is this third bird that occupies the space of Monet's painting, as I understand it. Monet's true subject was always just outside his reach. He turned his attention to things he knew were there, but that he could never really see or feel. By the time this picture was taken, Monet could speak openly about the role of impossibility in his practice. He had come to recognize that part of painting was acknowledging what lay beyond his grasp, even though this elusiveness still drove him mad. The goal of my work on Monet is to illuminate the complexity of arriving at this point. The paintings on which I focus show Monet working to understand the contingencies of vision, coming to know on his own terms that one could look very hard and see nothing at all, and that fixing the fleeting effects of light en plein air is inherently bound to a sense of transience and loss. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I love the dissection of that painting and the comparison to landscape and atmosphere and dissolving. And I'm struck, I mean, I guess I see everything through the lens of Berthe Morisot, of course, but that there's the unfinished canvas and the brushwork and that merging of figure with ground, and also just thinking again about her gauzy kind of toilette scenes and how it's completely subverted in this very tragic, very sad painting. So I love that you gave it this context to look at something that might seem like an anomaly or a one-off in his production, but be able to kind of pull it through in a different way of thinking about the artist and memory and, I don't know, the practice of painting, and how things that seem disparate, in fact, as you're arguing, you know, are not in that conception of how he's making paintings at this time.
Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to jump on your mention of Morisot, because I think there is so much interesting work to be done around duets. You know Morisot so well, and as I've said to you before, I think there's something really interesting to look at between Monet and Morisot. You have that fantastic painting. Of course, I'm forgetting the title, which is all in white, and it's like it looks almost like snow. It's not in the back of her, but there's something similar, I think, in the way that they're looking the world around them that I find really interesting.
Mm-hmm. She had his paintings hanging in her salon studio, and he had paintings of hers in his home too, so they were admirers of each other. Talk about no man or woman's an island, again, that we want to think about artists being in these like separate camps. And of course they have friendships and relationships and drama that, you know, they're humans in that way, and how that infiltrates. So we have a little bit of time, and I've been leading the conversation up here, but now that we have come to a nice, I think, sort of tail end of these different looks and overviews and speed dating and deeper dives in, I want to ask you all if you have questions that you want to talk about in our time that remains with each other that perhaps haven't come out yet, or that in the very least are bite-sized that we can kind of chew on at least and take with us to dinner. Putting them on the spot.
Well, I just to say, I am so amazed by all three of you. Nikki, you basically gave an entire refresher course on art history in a very short time.
It was supposed to be 5 minutes. I'm sorry, everyone.
No, but that was so impressive. I was like, wow, that was really good. Who needs art history 101? Just come sit here. But I think that it's really, I mean, it's exciting for me, someone who's no longer working in academia, but to see these really interesting and different approaches. And to, back to what you said earlier, André, these paintings won't stop giving. I I'd never, after both of your, what you've said on Monet and time and what you've said about the sand, I mean, I'm not looking at those paintings in the same way. And that to me is really exciting. So it's a lot to digest and then ask another question. But I find that, to the question that we started talking about when you kindly invited us to come here, oh, where's it going? I kind of feel like it's not dead. There's so much, there's so much to do.
I'm not sure I have a question for everybody, but a comment, but maybe you'll respond. What strikes me as something that joins the different approaches that I think we've seen tonight is that there is a new desire on the part of the last 10, 20 years to really think through what one might call the ethics of Impressionism. That if in earlier scholarship their form was a much more dispassionate kind of category, and even history, I think, can be a much more dispassionate kind of category that one just throws into the past. What these approaches share to me is to think through the emotional, and Mary-Dailey, that was amazing. Like I can't wait to see this. So and the kind of critical, ethical responsibilities we have towards the world, and that the Impressionists weren't these dispassionate chroniclers of modern life, but actually they were much more passionate engagers and human subjects, and that I think all these methods bring out in interesting ways. So maybe you'll agree or you disagree. I'm not sure.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that yes, I agree with that, and I think just to build on that a lot of this comes through. I think we all were very careful to look at the objects themselves, right, and to try and ask the questions of the pictures. Your original question was, are we bringing our our contemporary eye back in time? And I think when you might use our contemporary way of looking at it from a different perspective, but that a lot of these things are still coming from the works themselves.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you said that. And I will not go through the little bit. Many of you who know me here at the museum know that working with conservation and the physical object is something that I put at the heart of many of my projects and work. And you've seen it in some of my exhibitions. I've given many talks with Laura Hartman, our painting conservator, who is meant to be with us on this panel tonight. Congrats to the new mama and her healthy baby girl. So I was going to step in to talk a little bit about, again, from the museum professional perspective of discoveries that are coming through the objects themselves. So these are x-rays of one of our great Monet water lilies. That it's like a lot of myth busting, right? That they painted all en plein air, all in one go, outside before the motif, and then that was it. And then x-ray show with Monet, not just in his later work, but that this is an x-ray of our water lilies painting, the clouds, where the red outlines are where Laura is showing forms that you can see on the surface of the pictures in raking light. So these brushstrokes that don't align with the color, for example, tell us that this has been worked, that painting had dried, and he kept going back in. We are not good at reading x-rays. She is, and she's outlining forms, in fact, that she sees, lots and lots of water lilies and flowers, for example. Oops, I think it didn't make it in, but we have basically, when you go back to the final picture, you just don't see them at all, this process of reworking. So, busting the myth that they never painted in the studio again, that it was all in one go. It was very deliberate, it's very thoughtful. This is not a photograph, it's not a snapshot, it's not a window on the world, as they were all accused of, and as sometimes we reduced them to. But there was so much more, and then using the object to talk to us. So we're talking about critical perspectives and lenses, and how we're looking at these things with our modern eyes, but trying to be fair in how we apply that, thinking as we're never going to be successful of what it felt like in this time to experience these things. And so I would offer forth one way too is to consider the object as a person in a way, sort of objecthood, if you will. There are very basic things we get from the backs of works. It's fabulous. Degas pastel that was in one of the Impressionist exhibitions in the collection of the Nelson Atkins, where I used to work and was working on a big collection catalog where we were working with scientists, conservators, the way that Chicago did for their SysCat that Genevieve worked on. Everything from provenance to understanding, production of materials. They answer questions like dating, attribution, sometimes, not always, authenticity. They speak to the market. Amazing Signac that was a recent gift to the DMA from the Hines family that's on view on the second floor. Signac was not an artist that was collected a lot. It doesn't have a deep provenance. It didn't change hands a lot. This is its original strainer, its original canvas. It's never been lined, which means that we get spoiled. Hard to see here, but there's actually an original stamp that can tell us about the maker of the materials, the dates, etc. This has never been removed from its strainer, and we recently cleaned it. Or the Signac that's in the McDermott collection again, where it's not been lined, stayed relatively out of the hands of the market in private collections, and all of this information, stamps on the canvas, stamps on the stretcher, are just a beginning to answer some questions. You clean a painting and it goes from being a dusk scene to a morning scene. I mean, think about how we interpret, because we think what we're looking at is like what it was on the artist's easel, and they're not. Even new art like this has a life, and we think what we see is real. And the object itself is always going to tell us something a little different. If you know my work on Van Gogh, I'm obsessed with fading pigments in the 19th century. Purples had disappeared because the reds disappeared, so I'm not going to bore you with that. If you saw my exhibition, you know the kind of work that I'm interested in doing, or even what the canvas can tell us about sequencing, about authenticity, about certain myths of artists that may or may not have worked as solo geniuses. So an artist like Van Gogh, who ordered his rolls of canvas, you can literally take those x-rays of the canvas, feed it into a supercomputer, and it creates these sort of heat maps, if you will, the warp and weft threads. It's a unique fingerprint. So you can literally reconstruct with an artist like Van Gogh, who was ordering from his brother rolls of canvas while he was living in southern France. And based on those unique signatures, you can actually start to reconstruct the bolts of cloth that in our Olive Grove exhibition that I had here a couple years ago, the big research question, why we did all that technical study, was what was the order? What was the dating? Which might seem like it's not such an interesting question to those of us outside of art history, but to bring it all back to the idea again that starts with Vasari, in the Renaissance, of this idea of this like solo artist. So at the Nelson Atkins, again, they had this amazing Poussin that you see there on the left, whose authenticity had been questioned at one point. It was thought to be a very good period copy of a missing original. You should always be a bit suspicious when you hear the missing original. At a certain point, that got turned around, but it hadn't been widely published and accepted. And so taking that technology that developed with Van Gogh paintings and applying it backwards to 17th century paintings, the Poussin had been a commission by Richelieu with a series of works that were all these triumphs, and x-raying it with a work that it relates closely to in the National Gallery's collection to see what happens. And it was the best match that the canvas weave matching guys, TCAP as they used to be known, had ever seen in terms of canvases being cut from the same bolt, which in the 17th century, they were not long bolts. Already that tells you that they had to have been in the studio at the same time. And then there was a third painting thought to be a not great copy of a lost original by Poussin, also in the National Gallery, London's collection. That was really just thought to be a so-so mediocre copy, because Poussin would only paint consistently good pictures, right? And he was believed, because someone said this, back in the day, that he didn't work with studio assistants, he didn't have a workshop. And we believe that. It was written down in the 17th century, and that's it. That's the story. And so we asked the National Gallery at the time, would you give us an x-ray of the other one? You've got nothing to lose. If they don't match, it doesn't say anything at all. They could have come from different bolts of cloth. But if they do match, then you just got a Poussin back in your collection. Not that they needed another one, but This is literally the last slide, and I said I wasn't going to do it, but here we are. But this is the kind of what we can do in a museum that opens the door to changing how we see artists, their production, busting all these myths. You know, and I skipped past all the Van Gogh color fading, but we basically have to rewrite almost everything that's been published on Van Gogh and his application of color theory, because we thought his paintings were blue and yellow, and that he bent the rules, that it wasn't purple and yellow contrasting complementaries on the color wheel. Now we know that in many instances they were purple. The reds faded. They were new synthetic colors in the 19th century. So if you want to read about Van Gogh in color, like, you have to, you can't go back too far. You have to take it with a grain of salt. So this idea, too, that the objects themselves are providing these new ways. They become their own voice now, I believe, in finding things that are concrete, or in the very least that show us, after all these tomes have been written and all the ink spilled, how little we actually know and can say with any kind of certainty. So yeah, so there's one more voice I'm going to throw on the table, which is, you know, go back again to your point, Genevieve, of what is the art actually telling us? Where can we have fun and tap dance and do acrobatics in terms of dreaming and thinking and becoming inspired by what we see, and not wanting to be too literal by the fact, you know, and what's the other end of it, which is what do we think we can know? Big questions to end our chat on tonight. With that, I'm afraid we really are at the end of our evening, and you all have been amazing to sit here with us for so long. But thank you, everyone, for coming out, and my amazing panelists. Thank you. And you've got 2 weeks to see the show here before it closes. Thanks again.